The undead, the infected, the past, the wasted, the living dead, the walking dead, freaks, geeks, zeeks, corpses, hungries, bonies, fleshies, empties, hissers, boomers, runners, clickers, stinkers, rippers, eaters, rotters, walkers, growlers, roamers, muertos, lurkers, biters, cannibals, ghouls, deadheads, zedheads, lame brains, cold bodies, zombs, zombie, zombie, and zombies.
Never has a beast of horror gone by so many different names. In the grand scheme of things, zombies are a bit of a new addition to the horror lexicon, starting life as Haitian folklore and morphing into the hordes of shambling cannibals we know today. Zombies are sort of in a league of their own when it comes to the monster horror genre. They're not a singular antagonistic force, they're a horde, and the only thing that can stop them is a knock to the head or a second death of some sort.
Over the past few decades, it's felt like these cannibalistic undead, mutants, fungi, whatever, have been in a golden age in terms of both quality and quantity of media surrounding them. For a much younger version of myself, this narrative boon of blood, bile, and body parts was a horrific wonderland which offered never-ending giddy conversations about apocalypse plans. But a more current version of me has reached a point of apathy towards the undead. Considering the slowdown in mainstream zombie titles of recent memory, I think that the general audience is feeling that fatigue as well. Seeing them nowadays in games or movies is almost a deterrent. However, that's drawing conclusions based on anecdotal evidence and assumptions, which is the start of a theory, but not the basis of a conclusion. So I set out to chart the broad trends of zombie media, analyzing books, TV, film, and video games to see if I wasn't the only one losing interest in the stories of the undead. By analyzing the different eras of zombie media, we might be able to pinpoint the exact moment most people became overwhelmed with zombie fatigue.
It's a very prevalent fear in Haiti because the zombie is real, right? It's not abstract.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
The resurrection times vary wildly. We have reports of it happening in as little as 3 minutes.
But they're not alive.
You tell me.
When there is no more room in hell, the dead will walk the earth.
I started my research for this episode in the summer of 2022, trying to collect and catalog every single piece of zombie media I could find. Now, in doing so, and in trying to inevitably release this very long video, I had to make a hard cutoff point somewhere, so I stopped at 2021 so that I didn't have to keep constantly adding to the list. I also wanted the media that I show to fully focus on zombies and not just relegate them to the background, which requires a lot of judgment calls as to what does and doesn't make the cut. Which means that Castlevania doesn't count because it has these guys, Community doesn't count because of this episode, and the Bible doesn't count because Lazarus and some other guy came back from the dead. There are some notable exceptions to that rule, but I'll make sure to point that out when we get there. In the interest of looking at the entire lineage of zombies, I'm gonna avoid the purist's view. Zombies take on different meaning for different creators, so if the auteur and the audience say it's a zombie, arm up and aim for the head. For the film category, I included foreign and independent movies that saw major or minor distribution in some way, shape, or form. In the books category, I combined novels, comics, graphic novels, and manga. For those last three, I only counted the first book in the series, not each volume. Television shows include anime and are measured by how many series were airing simultaneously. The video game category has the most restrictions. I decided that I'd only include titles that were released physically or ones that came out on major platforms like Steam, PSN, and the Xbox Store. Most of the major iOS or Android apps made the jump from phone to console, so I didn't have to comb the App Store for zombie games. In addition to that exclusion, I also didn't include browser games as they aren't well documented, and much like popular apps, the most well-known of these made it to a bigger market later on. Again, I had to make a lot of judgment calls. I'd give each of these graphs about a 4 to 5% margin of error, but with the meat and potatoes out of the way, let's skip dessert and go straight for the brains.
The birthplace of the zombie starts on a Caribbean island in the 16th century. Haiti, a French-owned agricultural haven following in the footsteps of wealthy American plantation owners, saw the mass importation of kidnapped people from parts of Western and Central Africa. These enslaved individuals were then forced to conform with their captors' ways of life and Catholic beliefs. Over time, many of the traditional African religions fused with their captors' compulsory Catholicism, a combination that resulted in a whole new religion, Haitian voodoo. For those of you just listening to the video, I want to make it clear that voodoo here is spelled V-O-D-O-U. It's kind of an important thing, but I'll get to that here in a second. The imagery of zombies were created as a depiction of enslaved life at this point in time, believing that a natural death would take your spirit back to the homeland, whereas taking your own life would keep you stuck working on the plantation forever as a lifeless, soulless husk. This need for advocacy against suicide stemming from both high rates seen during this time, as well as the long-held but not biblically supported Catholic belief that those who kill themselves go to hell. No cannibalism, no mass hordes, just an infinity of the horrors they were already facing. While not directly tied to voodoo, the ethos of the religion clearly played a part in the formation of this folklore. After a hard-fought revolution, the people of Haiti achieved their freedom in 1804. Voodoo maintained its prominence, but as the religion grew across the island, parishioners of the faith would break off into different schools of thought due to the conflicting beliefs, the rifts stemming from whether or not to keep the Catholic aspects of the religion. More importantly, however, a bigger discussion was going on as the country would sink into turmoil as the French sought reparations for the uprising, and refused to legitimize Haiti's independence until they were paid. Due to this, the slave as a zombie symbolism would continue well into the turn of the century. In 1915, under the guise of wanting to help stabilize the country, the US invaded Haiti. Military leaders under the command of President Woodrow Wilson would force locals into unpaid infrastructure work. Patrick Sylvain, Haitian-American author, professor, and poet, succinctly described the interaction between the occupying force and the locals in a 2019 NPR podcast about the history of zombies.
And they had never encountered autonomous, independent black men who resisted white rule. And so how do you then demonize these people who resisted, call them cannibal? Then the black man, the black body, becomes a consumer of flesh.
This is the point of appropriation, seeing those who stole the folklore, adding exaggerated elements, and recentering stories around white American characters.
During Wilson's occupation of Haiti, writer William Seabrook would visit the island for research, later publishing his book The Magic Island, a novel where he would over-dramatize the religious ceremonies he witnessed, making them out to seem more like cult rituals that reanimate the deceased. This is one of the few works that doesn't fully center around zombies, but it makes the cut because it's arguably one of the first pieces of literature on the subject, laying the groundwork for future depictions of zombies. But if I'm being honest, part of me thinks that this book was a ploy to make readers think his future flesh-eating endeavors were an act of journalistic experimentation. If you're at all curious, Seabrook goes into great detail describing the taste of cooked human flesh in his 1931 book, Jungle Ways, comparing it to a fully developed veal. A quick tangent, most sources claim that 1929's The Magic Island was the first zombie book, but an argument could be made that H.P. Lovecraft's 1921 story Herbert West Reanimator was the first instance of zombies in fiction, even though the story follows a narrative more akin to Frankenstein's monster. While I'm feeling exceptionally pedantic, if we really want to find the earliest use of that word in literature, there's Médéric Louis-Élie Moreau de Saint-Mary's 1997 book Topographical, Physical, Civil, Political, and Historical Description of the French part of the island of Santo Domingo, which when translated reads,
"A young ebony-skinned beauty, whom a zombie tail frightens to the bone, stays awake waiting for him, lets him in through a door that she knows how to open quietly, and has but one fear, which is that her wait was in vain."
Semantics aside, back to Seabrook's work.
With this sensationalized view of voodoo brought back to the States, the four-O'd voodoo would be born, misappropriating elements of Satanism and witchcraft and creating the black magic mythos that proliferated pop culture during this era, bringing us our first film, 1932's White Zombie.
By all accounts, this film was the first zombie movie ever made. Directed by Victor Halpern and written by Garrett Weston, this pre-Hays Code era film stars Bela Lugosi, the premier Dracula, as the antagonistic witch doctor. The plot of White Zombie follows two soon-to-be newlyweds as they visit a wealthy plantation owner friend who agreed to let them be married in his mansion. Here we get some Great Gatsby vibes as the main character, Monsieur Beaumont, the owner of the estate, wishes to change the mind of the bride. Even with his immeasurable wealth, he still cannot buy her affection. So he does what any scorned millionaire would do in this situation. That being visiting a witch doctor to get a potion that turns her into a mindless zombie so that he can take the place of her husband. During the wedding reception, Madeline coincidentally and mysteriously dies. Who could have seen that coming? This leads to her husband Neil teaming up with local skeptic Dr. Brunner, and the two set off to investigate. Later on, finding out that Madeline is still alive and that the witch doctor has turned on Beaumont, who now at this point is in the process of succumbing to the same fate as Madeline, eventually coming around to save the day and discovering that love was the cure for zombification. This film is not nearly as bombastic as the Seabrook's Magic Island depiction. The elements of the folklore are still present. The zombies have no free will of their own, and the wealthy are exploiting that fact. The title, White Zombie, is meant to imply that Madeline turning into a zombie as a white woman is a unique circumstance. But that's kinda hard to decipher as the film is shot in a colorless format with dimly lit sets, thus making all the blackface used not work as intended, which also makes this title seem out of place. Might not have been seen that way back in the 30s, but here in the 20s, it's obvious. Victor Halpern would go on to write and direct Revolt of Zombies 4 years later, taking place in World War I. Halpern tries to overlay the tenets of the Four-Ode Voodoo onto Buddhist Cambodians, divorcing zombies of any cultural context and attempting to make them into a homogenized force that can be placed into any foreign group of non-white, non-Christian people. It doesn't work all that well, but then again, nothing in this film really does. The narrative being an inverse of Halpern's previous film. The focus is more on the romance and less on the zombies. Except this time, the protagonist turns everyone except the girl into a zombie, forcing her to love him. In the middle of a film that poses the question, should we use zombies to help win World War I, and the ethics of what that could mean, we get this incredibly boring, underdeveloped love triangle. This style of zombie would remain popular for quite a while, with the only major departures being 1955's Creature with the Atomic Brain, which substitutes the use of black magic for atomic-era science, and 1961's Dr. Blood's Coffin, which was not only the first time these creatures would be seen in color, but also the first to portray zombies with rotting flesh. Other than those few exceptions, most of the films in this era still portrayed zombies as mindless workers who killed on command.
Unfortunately, the voodoo era of zombies is easily one of the most forgotten eras, and that's a real shame because the context and history of the Haitian folklore adds a lot to these creatures. What we see here is not the undead coming back to torment the living, but rather wealthy individuals tormenting subjugated people through life and on into death. This original imagery would be obfuscated and used as a tool to tell white-centered stories, much in the same way as wealthy plantation owners would use slaves to build wealth. It's almost a 180 from what we see zombies as today, and yet tells a much more bleak story than anything to come.
1968's Night of the Living Dead is responsible for this whole mess of hungry dead folks. The way that this film has held up over the decades is astounding. With George Romero's solid understanding of horror storytelling, collaborative methodology, and wealth of knowledge pertaining to the history of zombies, what we get is a masterclass in horror cinema, recontextualizing zombies from niche, poached folklore to once again being a vessel to showcase inequality. The zombies seen in Night of the Living Dead are a mixture of true Haitian folklore, Herbert West Reanimator by H.P. Lovecraft, and Richard Matheson's 1954 novel I Am Legend. Romero has taken the undead from their place as subservient puppets and transformed them into a force of nature that cannot be controlled, changing the dynamic of stories told within this subsection of horror. The biggest change to the status quo was a shift to a more concise and consistent set of rules for how the undead operate. Rules that will shape all of future zombie media to come, which are as follows. Number 1. Major head trauma is the only conclusive way to kill a zombie. Most previous films don't explore this and show survivors running away or trying unsuccessfully to hit center mass of the zombie. They were supposed to be more unstoppable. Now there is a definitive, effective way to dispatch them. Number 2. If a character is bitten, they are now infected and will soon die and turn into a zombie. Prior to 1968, most zombies came about due to mind control or magic, not infectious diseases. Number 3. The only motivation zombies have is feeding on the living, no longer motivated by a singular puppet master. Number 4. Zombies have very little in the way of motor function, physical ability being dependent on state of decay. They are still capable of small bursts of effort when they find food sources, but climbing, opening doors via the handle, walking up or down stairs are all out of their ability range. More importantly, zombies don't run. This is a rule that will be frequently broken in the years to come. Before this, zombies would not lose their motor function and would occasionally gain strength from their captor. Number 5. Being more disease-like in nature, zombies are more of a plague than a small horde of captured individuals.
These rules may seem familiar, but at the time there was no consistency with zombies. They were mysterious background fodder. Now, they're at the forefront of the picture.
On top of all that, Romero, at the suggestion of lead actor Dwayne Jones, returned zombies' original intent, a symbol for inequality and a blank canvas for other biting social commentary. The dead strip away the facade that society puts up, and people's true colors shine through as they fear for their lives, facing enemies that look like their neighbors, friends, and loved ones. It's why in a room full of people, the only person of color is the only person acting logically and trying to keep the group alive. Everyone speaks over him, ignoring the right choice and putting others in danger to act selfishly. By the end of the film, he is the only character alive and ends up getting shot by an all-white militia because no one gives a second thought about people of color during this time period. The dead are not all that you need to fear. Thematically twisting the aforementioned cannibalistic accusations made during the US occupation of Haiti meant to belittle and control unpaid laborers of color back on itself. In doing so, shining a light on the injustices experienced by the people who originated the concept of zombies, as well as the inequalities of the 1960s. Romero would go on to create many more films in the Of the Dead franchise, using zombies as a device to highlight societal flaws and question the foundation of what humanity is. Dawn of the Dead looks at the bleak reality of consumer culture. Day of the Dead explores the breakdown of society when communication collapses. Land of the Dead tackles wealth inequality. Diary of the Dead questions the emerging media landscape before that became cliche. And Survival of the Dead takes a big swing at pondering war. Looking at George's impact on zombies as a whole, I think too often it's only seen for its remodeling of a pre-established monster, but more credit should be given to his ability to give life to zombies in a form of metaphorical meaning, again reinstating their potent messaging of how cruel people can be.
In 2015, my parents took me to the Days of the Dead horror convention that took place in Indianapolis, Indiana. A place for horror geeks to meet iconic characters and also a place for juggalos to get baked and wait 12 hours for a Twisted concert that was going on next door.
There were swaths of actors doing signings and autographs who were in your favorite horror films for all of 17 seconds. You know, the kind of down-to-earth celebrities that are really fun to meet. Even Tobin Bell from the Saw franchise was there.
The big draw was George A. Romero, who was not only doing a meet and greet, but also was hosting a panel with Tom Savini and some of the other actors from his films.
This was separated into 3 different conversations, starting with a one-on-one with famous zombie makeup artist Tom Savini, then a round table with the actors from Dawn of the Dead, and it ended with an interview with George A. Romero himself.
At the end of the panel, there was a 30-minute Q&A, and I had to find something to ask. I mean, a prolific director is in the room, and I'm a young college wannabe director, so I have to ask him something. And again, being a fresh college student, I don't know much about camera stuff. And he was talking an awful lot about, oh, I worked with 8mm, 35mm, IMAX, and I just had to know, like, how did that change your process? He picks me to ask a question, and for 30 minutes, the entire duration of the Q&A, he answers that question, but not in any particular way that, I thought it would go. Instead, he goes, "The tech doesn't matter. The story's the only thing that matters. I just picked what I had." It's like he looked into my soul and knew the exact advice I needed to hear at that time. Because I was fresh to videography. I don't know what I was doing. I didn't know what I wanted to do. The stuff that I was making was just kind of whatever was the most fun to do. And so I may not be a hotshot film director, but I certainly don't think I'd be here having as much fun as I am without that advice.
A few years would pass before this new trend would take full effect. The next 3 zombie movies to be released would follow the old format. But after that, in 1971, I Eat Your Skin, directed by Del Taney, would combine Romero zombies in the context of the quadruple O voodoo. It's messy and not as well thought out as Night of the Living Dead, but it's the first film that would take the new zombie format and run with it, stumble with it. The next few decades would see a dramatic rise in zombie movies, mostly relegated to B-side horror niches. These films would show a preference towards comical amounts of violence and gore, the major standout film during this time period being Sam Raimi's Evil Dead trilogy. Fast forwarding to the end of the era, we see the birthplace of massively successful independent zombie films like 28 Days Later in 2002 and Shaun of the Dead in 2004, the former being one of the bleakest and most realistic depictions of the zombie apocalypse seen up until this point, and the latter being a flawless parody of the entire era of zombie films.
Any zombies out there? Don't say that. What? That? What? That? The Z word. Don't say it. Why not? Because it's ridiculous.
Across the 37 years that the Romero era takes place, there would be a total of 241 films produced starring zombies. That's almost 6.5 undead flicks a year. However, this period would also see the genesis of zombie video games. 1982 would be the year that Entombed was released for the Atari 2600, a side-scrolling maze game where you avoid zombies and run through catacombs. Don't be fooled by the ghosts on the box art. The game manual clearly states that you're running through catacombs of zombies. A cool little game, but nothing really exciting for the start of zombies in a new medium. Over the next 9 years, we'd be introduced to some interesting titles, like a strange tie-in with the Evil Dead for the ZX Spectrum, or ZX Spectrum, I'm not really sure. Zombies Ate My Neighbors for the Super Nintendo and Genesis, and House of the Dead for arcades and the Sega Saturn. Without hesitation, the biggest title to have come out of this era would be Resident Evil. This is a series that took zombies in an entirely different direction, and unlike Romero zombies, not many have followed this path. With 26 games, excluding the remakes, 7 films, 21 books, and a TV show, and much more to come, this series has created its very own niche within the zombie sphere, pushing the boundaries for what zombies can be and how they come about, going from a more standard approach in Resident Evil 1 and getting more and more bombastic as the series goes on. Resident Evil acts as a pseudo-barometer for the quality level in each of the eras of zombies. This one happens to have classic works that lay out deep roots for the console-defining titles. The next era would be controversial, titles here dividing the fan base due to some odd creative choices and some poor quality entries, with the current era showing a resurgence in quality and popularity.
This was sort of the Wild West of zombie games. You've got Typing of the Dead reskinning a light gun shooter to teach you how to keyboard with zombies. Then there's Stubbs the Zombie that uses the Halo engine
and also has one of the best soundtracks of all time, with popular 2000s indie bands doing covers of 40s and 50s songs. I wish I could play you some, but the whole soundtrack is online and linked below.
And then there's Oni Chambara, a game that I've played. It's like 14 games. I should have played at least one for this episode. There's 2 movies and a manga series.
Considering the length of this era, zombie literature lagged behind in numbers. I would assume that once the quote-unquote journalistic curiosity died down around the folklore, writing about monsters seen in films that weren't held in high regards wouldn't translate to good book sales. However, once the films started getting better, other media would slowly start to follow Romero's example. Fantasy novels would be the first to pick up the mantle. However, zombies would not be at the forefront, instead being relegated to side characters players or henchmen, like in the case of Dragon on a Pedestal by Pierce Anthony in 1983 and Conan the Defiant by Steve Perry in 1987. An era of firsts would follow. Tales of the Zombie would be the first fully fleshed out comic book series, published by Marvel Comics in 1973, seeing 11 issues and laying down the groundwork for Marvel to zombify their flagship characters later in 2005. Joe R. Lansdale would release On the Far Side of the Cadillac Desert with Dead Folks in 1983, becoming the first graphic novel released focused on the undead. Finishing up the series of firsts is Zombieland, created by the artistic duo Peach Pit. Running from 2002 to 2011, Zombieland is the first manga to center around the undead. This won't be the only time this franchise comes up, but more on that later.
The biggest book to come out of this era was Max Brooks' Zombie Survival Guide, a satirical guide for how to survive the apocalypse, even going so far as to hit the New York Times bestseller list on his first try. The first try in quotations because he spent 3 seasons on SNL, and his father is Mel Brooks! The importance of this book isn't so much the pedigree of the author, the sales numbers, or even how good the book actually is. It's more so that it sets Max up to write one of the tentpole zombie franchises in the next era, but more on that later.
The Romero era solidified zombies as a constant presence in the horror genre, not just for films, but in literature and video games as well. This new, more unified zombie variety gets away from the trivialization of Haitian folklore and transforms the undead into a force of nature, in doing so, allowing the hordes of cannibalistic corpses to take on new sets of meaning and symbolism. But when there's something successful to this scale, 2 things happen. 1, people will start seeing dollar signs, and 2, impressionable and up-and-coming creatives will want to pay homage. And the successes seen during this time period would help start a wildfire of zombie content in the following years.
The golden era of zombie media took place from 2006 to 2013, and I mean that in more of a quantitative perspective, but that isn't to say that there isn't a lot of quality to be found here. I don't think there's a better illustration for just how crazed people were for the undead at this point in time than an event that took place on college campuses across America. An event that has been declining in recent years, understandably so.
Humans vs. Zombies, or HVZ, was a nationwide LARPing campaign that college students played in their free time. Armbands would be worn by the living, and headbands would be worn by the deceased. Using Nerf guns, the human players would be able to fend off the foe undead, but if touched by a zombie, then the player would have to convert their armband to a headband and switch sides. There were other important rules, like buildings being safe zones where the game would have to stop, and you had to be a registered player in order to interact with the game at all. I remember seeing this being played on Purdue's campus when I was in high school, and again when I was in college at the hallowed grounds of Superintendent Chalmers' alma mater, Ball State.
Hey Chalmers, where are you from?
Well, I was born in Queens, went to Ball State, then made the move to Intercourse, Pennsylvania.
When this event started, I wasn't yet in college, but I was next to one, so I followed it and was really excited at the prospect of doing it when I got to college. But I didn't for some reason, and it's not because I thought I was above it. I mean, I was a young, cringy YouTuber at that point in time. If anything, LARPing would have made me that much cooler. Obviously, with the uptick of gun violence in schools across America, Humans vs. Zombies has slowly faded into the background. It's still played at college campuses today, but in far fewer numbers. But that shouldn't overshadow the fact that a few geeky individuals put a lot of time and hard work into giving us a slice of the apocalypse. And I think that pretty well sums up this era. Audiences were excited to see the undead in a way that almost strips away the horror, and all that's left is a fun fantasy apocalypse land.
The films of this era would give any hardcore zombie fan a touch of survivor bias. The highs were highs and the lows were deep and plentiful. If I had to list all the movies that I turned off within the first 30 minutes, most of them would come from this time period. However, contrasting that, there are some outstanding films that would help solidify this meandering menace in the tasty minds of your average viewer. George Romero would carry on his work through this era, but the 2 films he released would not be considered some of his best work. still maintaining his signature style, but not at the same caliber as his first 3 films. For better or for worse, this would be the era where independent zombie films would reign supreme. On the positive side, we'd get films like Fido that explore the idea of using zombies as pets, or 2012's The Battery, which is a road trip buddy comedy movie often cited as one of the best independent zombie films, period. There's also Dead Snow from 2009, which uses 1940s era fascists as the zombie threat. Not the first to do so, but by far is one of the most well known for it. However, those feel like they get outnumbered by Z-side low-budget horror films. Most of this schlock would have some kind of studio backing. These films often had very little time and budget and narratively relied on a single gimmick and contained uncomfortable amounts of unnecessary sexualization, which I assume was supposed to make up for the poor production. Films like 2008's Zombie Strippers, 2009's Zone of the Dead, 2010's Stag Night of the Dead, and many more. The issue here is that you can't just put a gimmick with a zombie and expect it to be entertaining outside of said gimmick. Ironically, the most important part of a zombie film is that it has some kind of heart and soul to it. But then there is the truly independent side, where someone just had a funny idea and wanted to shoot some cool practical effects. It's hard to tell the difference because the two end up looking and sounding the same. The only difference being one is a cash grab and the other is made for the people making the film.
Now I can sit here on my high horse all day and comment on how schlock zombie movies have ruined the genre for everyone, but that really misses the point, because you don't know why these films get made until you meet someone making one. In 2018, I had just moved to Austin, Texas, and I was looking to make friends and colleagues any way I could. So I volunteered at a local film fest called Fantastic Fest. It's a horror genre collection, and there I met a lot of cool people, some that I would even go on to make films with. But there was one person in particular who I met that was in the process of making her own zombie film. Now in 2018, anyone could make a movie, but she had real experience, having worked on 2012's John Carter and working with Danny Boyle on 127 Hours. This was the first time I'd ever met anyone with real life experience that wasn't a professor or a guest lecturer. She had pitched me her film Zombies vs. Snowboarders and showed me a trailer that she had made with some test footage. It looked goofy, but the passion was on full display and I was excited for the future of the flick. Towards the end of the festival, a big-name horror producer, whose name I forgot, invited her to dinner. There, she was going to pitch her project in hopes of securing funding. She came back with optimism, but looking at the now-defunct website and IMDb page, I don't think the funding was secured. But just look at this trailer. Snowboards with chainsaws, stunts, and actors that actually look like they're having fun. Not to mention the difficulty of filming on the side of a mountain in the cold. It's easy to only remember this era for being formulaic and kind of boring, but that negates a lot of people putting a lot of heart and soul into their films, which at the end of the day is the only thing that's important, which recontextualizes all of these campy zombies.
As far as major studio zombie flicks, we get a few ugly remakes of Romero's best work, adaptations of books like Warm Bodies, and a film that would help bridge the zombie gap, going from niche horror to the mainstream. Zombieland starring Mark Zuckerberg became the highest grossing zombie film of all time. Considering the star power and the studio marketing and the growing hype for all things undead, it's not surprising that Zombieland did well. It's a funny, quotable movie that showed the fun side of the zombie apocalypse that fans were already talking about. I find it interesting that you can track the general audience's feelings towards the undead based on box office numbers. Because in 2013, near the end of the era, World War Z would become the highest grossing zombie film. There are a lot of reasons why this could have happened: bigger marketing budget, a larger zombie fan base, pre-established popular source material, that guy that dated Angelina Jolie for a while, are all potential factors. But I think the growing zombie audience started to crave darker and darker narratives, in response to the high volume of low-quality films being pumped out during this era.
Now that's speculation, and when you consider the media that follows, I think it's safe to make that assumption. This era is notorious for cutting off some of the zombies' political edge. Seeming to trivialize the meaning that zombies had taken on in the previous era, due to no one individual title, but rather because it was taking on an almost caricature-like form which people weren't taking seriously anymore.
Zombie literature would see a similar heyday of content as the other mediums. However, most of the popular series would see adaptations that end up being far more popular than the books that spawned them. Robert Kirkman was already a renowned author before he came into the zombie world. After seeing success with his series Invincible, he would go on to publish The Walking Dead. In a few years' time, the comic would almost completely be overshadowed by the television show he crafted with Green Mile director Frank Darabont. In response to the show's success, Kirkman and a few other authors would produce 10 full-length novels in the world of The Walking Dead, primarily focusing on the rise and fall of the city of Woodbury and the Governor from Season 3.
Moving away from The Walking Dead, again I have to bring up World War Z because it was a hit book before it broke the box office. The novel is a series of unattached vignettes meant to paint a more realistic picture of what a global zombie apocalypse might look like. World War Z is one of the highest selling zombie novels, the highest grossing zombie film, and would also get a game that doesn't quite live up to that high expectation set by the other two. Anecdotally, I find that when I bring up the conversation of zombies, World War Z gets mixed in at the same rate as like The Walking Dead and George Romero. I think that's odd. The book's good, the movie's okay, and the video game everyone's forgotten about, but does it deserve to be at the peak with those other two massive giants? I don't think so, but that's not for me to decide.
Likewise, the graphic novel for iZombie ran from 2010 to 2011, ending 3 years before the CW would juice this property for 5 seasons. On the opposite side, a few series would not see any adaptation but would still garner significant popularity and longevity. Storied author John Mayberry is a name that should be better known in the zombie sphere. His contributions to this genre include 15 novels and 2 comics. His most notable series in this regard being Rotten Ruin, a set of 6 novels aimed at the young adult demographic. Aside from that, even his biggest franchise of books, following the exploits of Baltimore detective Joe Ledger, which isn't wholly about zombies, dips into all things occult, including the undead. In a similar fashion, Shannon Maguire's Newsflesh series, written using the pen name Mira Grant, would go on to have a successful run of novels as well. This series was a refreshing take during this era. Choosing not to focus on surviving the immediate outbreak, characters in this franchise are already in the thick of it and have learned the basics. The novels focus on communication and life after getting past the initial shock of zombies. This concept would be explored in more popular works in the coming years, making it feel sort of quaint, but it was one of the first to express that take, which helped it stand out.
Now for what I think arguably kicked off this golden era, video games. If there are 2 things you can murder without remorse, it's red armband fascists and zombies, and video games really took to that.
Shoot 'em, stab 'em, hit 'em with a chair, machetes, crowbars, use 'em all, they don't care. And right out of the gate, Capcom ran with this mentality on Dead Rising. Taking notes from Dawn of the Dead, everything you can find in the mall is fair game. The freedom to dispatch these new wave mall walkers is unmatched and extremely impressive, not only in a spectacle or gameplay sense, but a technical one as well. Getting this many zombies on screen in an early 360 game was a monumentous task. No game prior to Dead Rising had the capability to render hordes like this. It's a milestone in video game history for a lot of reasons, but most importantly, it answered the question on every middle schooler's mind. Can you kill a zombie with a foam finger? To which Capcom responds with a resounding kinda.
It's a real shame they only made 3 games.
Other astounding video game zombie achievements would include Dead Space for perfecting alien zombies, taking a more Half-Life approach to reanimation and afterlife goals. Left 4 Dead, The Killing Floor, and Black Ops Zombies would bring friends together for days on end with standout co-op gameplay. So much so that Killing Floor would get a sequel, Black Ops Zombies would become a series staple, and Left 4 Dead 2 would stay in the top 50 most played Steam games for over a decade. A mod for Arma 2 called DayZ would gain so much popularity that it would become its own fully fledged title. Oregon Trail's director cut revitalizes and exceeds the source material it's parodying. I cannot stress this enough. This is one of these hidden gem games that a lot of people talk about. I highly recommend it. Popular iPhone app Plants vs. Zombies would leap from addicting phone game to fully fledged hero shooter with the Garden Warfare series, with the most recent entry in this franchise, Battle for the Neighborville, having a shockingly fun, solid single-player experience with levels that have such an incredible depth of detail that you almost forget that PopCap is owned by EA. The raw innovation and passion for zombie games is most evident in this category of media for this era. Not only are these games expanding how we view zombies, but they're also expanding expectation for gaming as a whole through sheer quality of all these titles. One of my favorite aspects of this era are all the zombie spin-offs: Red Dead Redemption's Undead Nightmare, Yakuza Dead Souls, and later on in the next era, Yaiba Ninja Gaiden Z. These games act as non-canon sequels, doing a sort of where are they now mission style structure. At the time, I thought these were just cash grabs, riding a trend for the extra buck. But speaking of cash grabs that are riding a trend for the extra buck,
I'm getting them coming and going. Wait, that didn't sound right. Hey, I wasn't gonna call Mommy. Hope I can get to that phone before I stink worse than I already do.
Not one of Neil Patrick Harris's finest moments.
But having played them recently, I found that they're just as good as the main series, adding an extra layer to Red Dead's already fantastic combat system with the necessity of headshots, and Dead Souls being a great introduction to the Yakuza franchise as the stakes are low and you meet a lot of characters from the previous entries. Not to mention the gameplay is just wildly fun. You can't really discuss zombie video games without mention of Telltale's The Walking Dead, a series that launched its developers into the stratosphere and added to the popularity of an already beloved franchise, unlike some other games that just ride the coattails. What the writers were able to do with this franchise is astounding, creating characters so compelling that even as the studio was dying, Skybound Entertainment would throw significant amounts of money at the team just so they can keep it on life support and finish out Clementine's story. And that's even more impressive when you look at how fast Skybound pulled funding for Overkill's The Walking Dead. That game got a few updates before getting pulled from Steam entirely.
When this game launched, Overkill, the developers, were going through some issues, and Skybound Entertainment was not happy with how the game was performing.
But this is the Payday 2 folks. They're one of the only studios whose player base is patient enough to let the game get better over time, and they had this game set up just the same. And the worst part is, Overkill's The Walking Dead isn't even that bad of a game. Sure, it came out a little glitchy, but it's not worth pulling it off of Steam. Sorry, I'm just a little sour about this one still. The Walking Dead franchise in video game form is odd to me. Aside from the 5 TT games, there are also 5 iOS games, 6 if you include the Endless Runner for Fear the Walking Dead, 2 VR games, a spin-off with the Escapist series, and one of the worst games of 2013. The iOS games are all that weird idle RPG style, the Raid Shadow Legends type of game, with a bridge constructor game to throw off the scent. The Walking Dead survival instinct for the PS3 and 360 was riding high on the Daryl dies, we riot sentiment that was going on at the time. Norman Reedus and Michael Rooker would lend their voices to this project, and the two seemed genuinely excited for this game, which made it look like a slam dunk for Walking Dead fans, but unfortunately that wouldn't be the case. The story is of no consequence, and it's neither engaging nor well written. We don't learn anything about the Dixon brothers, and to this day, fans question the canonicity of the game. which the extra lore was the only reason I wanted to play it. Without that, it's just a generic FPS from the 7th generation, and I think you know what comes with that territory. Though I will say that there are some cool systems at play here. I like the side quests that will net you survivors, better weapons, and supplies, and that you have to manage those resources before you can go into the next level. On paper, it's got a lot of great ideas and almost nails the execution, but it's a rushed product, so you get what you pay for. Functioning gameplay, neat ideas, and a boring story make this a disappointing title, but far from the worst thing that came out in 2013.
This final game would go on to set expectations for what zombie media would look like in future generations. Naughty Dog's The Last of Us would answer the question, what if zombies were just a fun guy?
You've got mail.
It's a cease and desist from my father.
The Last of Us is what I like to call a zombie reset. Much like Night of the Living Dead was a reset on voodoo zombies, just as 28 Days Later was a gritty and realistic reset on B-side niche horror zombies, The Last of Us is also a reset on this era's tropes, which came from the overabundance. Naughty Dog would reshape Romero-style zombies into fungal-ridden, powerful creatures with the same goal in mind. A new IP from the creators of Uncharted had a difficult journey ahead considering their competition, being released in a year of heavy hitters, but being able to stand out and be considered one of the big three of that year, and for good reason. This is a zombie game like no other seen before. Dense environments that allow players to take on the infected in any way they choose, resource management systems that don't bog down the pace of the game, and heightens tension of the overall experience. Not to mention a dad simulator story that has yet to fall out of fashion. This is the moment that zombie games changed and would ultimately usher in a new era of what I would like to call prestige zombie titles. We'll revisit this in the next section, as it truly seems like a turning point for all of zombie media.
There is nothing that would make me more happy than spending another hour talking about the video games of this era. It's what made me fall in love with the Undead to begin with, and I think a lot of people in my age bracket feel the same. But there is one addition that overshadows video games in this era, and that's the addition of zombie television shows.
With a total of 14 shows airing in this time frame, Pushing Daisies is widely considered the first zombie show. But within the first 7 minutes of the premiere episode, the main character outright dismisses that.
You not to use the word zombie. It's disrespectful. Stumbling around, squawking for brains, it's not how they do. An undead, nobody wants to be un-anything.
So if you're one for semantics and want to rebel against the crowd, then 2007's anime Zombieland takes the spot as the first TV show on a technicality. Not surprising because, as I mentioned before, it was also the first zombie manga. Looking at just the stats, of the 14 shows produced, 6 were anime. A bit on the obscure side and not in a time period where access to these shows was quite as easy as it is today. And while you could consider that to dominate the zombie TV space, it's just not the truth.
I could continue to beat around the bush, but we all know how zombies gained their popularity through the adaptation of Robert Kirkman's graphic novel, The Walking Dead.
Having only ended last year, spanning an impressive 13-year run, The Walking Dead feels like it's always been present in my life. It's the last show that I remember watching live every Sunday night with my family and friends. AMC's The Walking Dead was a cultural moment much like Zombieland. It bridged the gap of niche horror to widespread popularity. It does so with a more serious tone that focuses more on the interpersonal struggles and less on the zombies. While in later seasons these zombies would start to break some of the Romero rules, it very much stays true to the vision from 42 years ago. And the ethical dilemmas that the group faces over the seasons ends up mirroring those seen in the Of the Dead films. It's a brutal show that rarely lets up on the gas pedal, but not in a way that holds potential to become outlandish and unbelievable. While you can nitpick... Wait a minute.
Looking at this footage, I could not believe my eyes. That is, in fact, famous actor James Allen McCune performing live for passerbys.
While you can nitpick the show's logic, no other franchise holds this level of realism for as long a time and as large of an audience. Even the more outlandish aspects like the Whisperers, people who blend in with walkers through the use of masks, scents, and walking cadence, make logical sense the more screen time they get. In being so consistent and so interactive with the fans, The Walking Dead solidified not only its place at the top of the charts, but also as a persistent presence in the lives of those who watched it. Season 1 of The Walking Dead was helmed by acclaimed director Frank Darabont. He clearly had a vision for this show that was unmatched, which is in line with his proclivity for quality adaptation of books. Darabont would use every connection at his disposal to gather up a cast that had pre-baked on-screen chemistry. However, almost immediately, the television show would split drastically from the graphic novels, adding new characters and details to moments that were sped past in the graphic novels. It's clear that Darabont appreciated what Kirkman had created, but also knew how to properly format this story for the sake of television. Without Frank's vision, this show would be missing some of its iconic characters. No one was screaming, "Daryl dies, we riot," while reading the graphic novels because he didn't exist outside of the show. The books and the show have major similarities, but they're also unique takes on this fictional setting without interfering with one another. When this show started, I remember it was like nothing I'd ever seen. It felt gritty and cinematic. To put it simply, the show looked like a comic without going full Sin City. The Walking Dead was in a league of its own, and the potential it held felt limitless. At the end of every episode, I remember my parents' living room filling with colorful conversations and debates about what we had just watched. And for those viewers who didn't have that same communal experience, AMC would contract Chris Hardwick to host a post-show called The Talking Dead, an interactive late-night talk show where members from the cast and other famous individuals would come and give their opinions, theories, and share on-set stories to the audience, who would then get to ask them questions. The push to endear fans to this series paid off. This was AMC's only IP which they owned 100% of. Breaking Bad and Mad Men were both co-owned by other companies. In the face of the extreme popularity and marketability of this show, AMC ended up slashing Darabont's budget for the second season, later on cutting him out of the project altogether. And what we got was one of the worst seasons of television I had ever watched. Rewatching it now, in quick succession, it's much different than waiting a week and fuming because the last episode you watched was all character conversation with little to no impact on the story as a whole. The first season boiled down to a formula where each episode was more or less a summation of a single graphic novel. However, AMC doubled the episode order, but required them to shoot more inside scenes to save on budget. So they stretched 3 books out to 12 episodes, and the viewers could sense that. When I watched this season live, I had the distinct feeling that this show had run its course and would get canceled after this season. But somehow, despite the very public removal of a key visionary and one of the most dull and lethargic follow-up seasons, The Walking Dead would continue on for another 9 seasons, making the crew's time at the farm feel like a blip on the radar. I've never seen a series recover from such a gross corporate overstep like this. If you want more details about this situation, the channel Your Movie Sucks made a very intricate series of videos dissecting this whole season 2 debacle. That series is linked below. The Walking Dead would go on for another few more seasons without a major hitch. Some characters would come and go, but ultimately the show retains its popularity and the fans were happy. That is until season 7, where we're introduced to our Voss-type villain. A little too likable, but also absolutely ruthless. Negan has come to be one of the most polarizing characters in all of television. Fans are still debating if he got the justice he deserved, and that's wild. This series is known for its outlandish yet grounded villains, but Negan is the only villain to get a redemption arc. which makes sense. You put Norman Reedus, Andrew Lincoln, and Jeffrey Dean Morgan in an interview room together and you've struck gold. It's unreal how traumatic the introduction of Negan is and how brutal that season would go on to be, but ultimately he becomes a beloved character, a true testament to the quality of the writing. The Walking Dead spans more than just its 177 episode run. Spin-off sister show Fear the Walking Dead is set to air its final season this year, surpassing its 103 episode current run. There are also 4 seasons of web exclusive content that aired simultaneously with the show, adding backstory and world building to things that the main series might have glanced over. Finally, there's the single season spin-off World Beyond that takes place after season 9 of the main series and holds a lot of implications for where the series will go. And that's not even to mention the 3 new spin-off shows meant to wrap up the loose ends from the main story coming out in the next few years. The Walking Dead is the single biggest unified zombie-based property, and its importance in the history of zombies should not be understated.
Coming back to the show to find out that it's maintained a high level of quality while avoiding another catastrophe like the second season has reinvigorated my love for zombie media. If there has to be a face of this genre, I'm glad it's The Walking Dead.
I find this to be a very conflicted time for zombie media. While it was a cornucopia of creativity, guilt-free violence, and odd escapism, the abundance feels like it cheapens the effect a little. To be fair, anything with significant meaning will ultimately lose that once it reaches the masses. Pieces that would use zombies to great effect would end up overshadowing themselves with clever effects or gameplay. The books in this era are a pleasant respite of authors subverting expectation and pushing zombies in a different direction. But again, that too would be overshadowed by big budget adaptations. As much as I loved this era when I was a kid, and for as many excellent pieces that could have only come out during this time period, I can't help but look back with an almost anti-nostalgia, for lack of a better term. The deeper I researched this topic, the more I've come to the realization that zombies are a tool. They are the set design in a Wes Anderson movie. They're the long shots in a Scorsese film. They're the musical edits of a Danny Boyle picture. What I mean to say is that zombies are not the focus. They are a piece in a storyteller's toolkit. But in this time period, that point gets missed over and over again in favor of putting zombies center stage so as to not confuse anyone. But like panning for gold, the more you sift through, the more flecks you find. With the sheer volume of media on this subject, there is plenty of gold, and thanks to the hands of time, the silt has settled back to the riverbed, and we're just left with the truly outstanding pieces in our hand.
I went into this video assuming that this era was going to be the fall off of zombie content due to the oversaturation of the previous era, but what I've found is a lot of quality in a lot of weird places. In the previous era, zombies achieved a commonplace status, but here we see them used in new and unique ways that change our perception on the monsters. Motion pictures motivated by meandering mountains of muertas would see a decline in releases. The graph shows a bell curve, peaking in 2008 and starting a decline in 2013. This could be for a variety of reasons. The growth of streaming services and how that favors television shows over movies, studios seeing diminishing returns on big budget zombie flicks, or the pandemic that we all just survived, souring our appetites for plague-related content. Train to Busan is one of the first times I've noticed a general audience going far out of their way to watch a foreign film, and said film reaching mainstream levels of success. While these zombies are similar to the previous era, the different cultural setting adds a nice new coat of paint. That, along with the spectacular production quality, makes for a film that was one of the first to reel me back into the genre after my college hiatus. I also view Train to Busan's success as the catalyst for this era's increased output of spectacular foreign zombie content. Much like the last era, the indie scene is where you find the standout films. 2014's Life After Beth starring Aubrey Plaza, 2015's Maggie starring Arnold Schwarzenegger,
and a full version of Ben Howling and Yolanda Ramke's excellent short film Cargo. But let me hit you with the one you most likely missed. Shunichiro Ueda's film One Cut of the Dead. It's the most meta film I've ever seen, with multiple perspective-altering twists that trick the audience into thinking certain moments are fourth wall breaks when they aren't, and vice versa. That's the best I can describe the film without giving too much away. Thematically, it's both a commentary on media as a whole, but also this genre specifically. Like I said, it's meta. And if you walk away from this video with one thing, it better be this film on your watch list. Clearly a labor of love, One Cut of the Dead is a definitive conclusion to the peak hysteria era in the same way that Shaun of the Dead was a definitive conclusion to the Romero era.
In this era of books, we see a similar decline to films, but we also get the conclusion to long-standing series like News, Flesh, and Rotten Ruin.
The biggest release in this era was notable comic writer Mike Carey's The Girl with All the Gifts. It's got a similar plot to The Last of Us if that game didn't need a sequel. The novel is based off of Carey's short story Iphigenia in Aulis. While working on the novel, Warner Brothers asked him to write the screenplay in tandem. Both would see success, however, Carey has not returned to writing about the undead.
I know I said I stopped my research in 2022, but a new graphic novel in the Walking Dead franchise came out centered around Clementine from the Telltale series. Not written by Kirkman, instead penned and illustrated by Tilly Walden, and I figured I'd give it a fair shake.
What I find about the decision to continue Clementine's story outside of an interactive medium is that it now canonizes specific choices made in the game. Even stranger still, you can't go from game to graphic novel without losing important context. You have to search out the one-shot comic called Skybound X. This book is a tester for different projects Skybound would release in the coming months. There are two non-Walking Dead stories, Ultra Mega and Manifest Destiny. Then there's the Rick Grimes 2000, a sci-fi reinterpretation of The Walking Dead. But the focal point of the book is Clementine Lives. There's not much story here outside of Clem leaving the nest for new adventures without her current friends. However, that raises the question, why not just include this at the start of the first graphic novel? There's a note at the end of the book from Alex Anton, the senior editor at Skybound Comics, who agrees with the difficulty of this project, stating,
"Bringing the beloved Clementine into comics for the first time is almost as daunting as surviving a horde of walkers."
A lot of fans were displeased with this move, as Clem had grown so much as a character in the games, only for her to seemingly regress and break the promises that she's made for the sake of continuing her story. However, having read the first book in the series, I can't help but draw comparisons to the character of Morgan from the television show. These two characters feel remorseful for surviving for so long, haunted by the deaths of almost every person they've ever loved. However, they're also the most well-equipped for being alone in the apocalypse. Both also see massive character growth that gets to a peak when something new challenges them, so they set off to find themselves again. Clem moving from game to graphic novel, and Morgan switching from the main series of Walking Dead to the spin-off Fear the Walking Dead. There's not much online complaining about Morgan's character arc starting back up, but boy howdy are people pissed about Clem. While I think that the move is shocking, I have a lot of faith that Walden can finish off this story right. But looking at this character through a meta-contextual analysis of the series, I see me in the first game playing as Lee, acting as a father figure, making decisions on behalf of Clem as she learns to fend for herself. The second game, I get to make the decisions as Clementine, helping her become a crafty survivalist that I've left the last game hoping she would become. The third game, you play as a different character teaming up with an older Clementine. Here, I'm benefiting from her incredible skills that I both taught and helped her hone. The final game, I'm back to playing as Clementine, but this time she fills the role that Lee filled for her in the first game, and by the end of this finale, we get to relish in the fact that Lee would have been proud. Then we transition to a passive interaction, and I can no longer help her, only watching as she adventures on her own, leaving the nest, so to speak. While I know that she's ready for the world, I'm helpless, not being able to assist in her journey in any meaningful way, adding a new layer of tension. It's full circle parenting, and I think it's a beautiful thing.
In 2017, they released a cookbook for The Walking Dead, and with all silliness and sarcasm aside, it's genuinely really good. It has two themes: Walking Dead, obviously, and survival.
This combines for recipes that are not only seen and spoke of in the show, but are also accurate to the ingredients that the characters might have had on hand, while most importantly, being tasty. I made Carol's cookies seen in Season 5, Episode 13. They weren't too bad, subtly sweet but with a great texture, substituting butter for shortening, and pre-melting the chocolate bar before incorporating. It's a pretty decent cookie. I wanted to make the cookies she made in Season 6, Episode 12 when she was strapped for ingredients and used canned beets, but that recipe called for acorn flour and I've already overcommitted to this project. The real star of the show is Morgan's peanut butter bars, which get brought up twice in the show.
Michonne?
Yeah?
Back when you were in that place, where I lived, did you take one of my protein bars?
Morgan. Michonne did steal that protein bar.
Oh, I know.
Do you like peanut butter?
I do.
These were amazing, keeping with the theme of practical, short, and delicious. On top of these recipes, a quarter of the book is dedicated to survival information. Things like how to make a water filter, how to make a fishing hook out of a pop tab, different campfire cooking setups, and how to forage and test to see if something is edible. I am genuinely impressed with the quality of this tie-in cookbook.
First category to really throw a wrench into my theory was video games, because the stats tell one story and the context tells a different one.
The main culprits being Steam, Unity, and a free indie game. Let's start with that last one.
Unturned is an impressive game, starting life as a Roblox mod and eventually making it to Steam after a few iterations. Made almost single-handedly by a very young man named Nelson Sexton. Unturned maintains the aesthetic of Roblox with zombies, but underneath is a dense survival system. It's similar to Rust, and while survival games of this ilk are starting to see similar saturation to open world titles, Unturned was an early pioneer of the genre. Not to mention, the game is free and there are always people playing it. Unturned is a resounding victory for both its creator and its player base. But when the scent of success is in the air, imitators lurk around every corner. Unturned is not directly the reason for the following events, but its success was misinterpreted by a lot of developers who saw a quick cash grab and an almost non-existing vetting process on Steam and said, I think I can do that too. In 2012, Steam would create a democratic program called Steam Greenlight, where for $100 you could put your game on the Steam voting boards. If enough players voted yes, your game would get released on Steam. Sounds like a great idea. Allow players to pick the games they want to play. In theory, it should work. In practice, it was deeply flawed. There was nothing protecting the sanctity of the voting process. Bad actors almost immediately found loopholes. What we have here is a sort of twister of terror, a low entry fee combined with an almost guaranteed way to get your game on the storefront, along with an unsuspecting general audience naive to the coming wave of games centered around achievement farming, stale memes, and Unity asset flips. Steam Greenlight would shut down in 2017, but not before a flood of low-effort games hit the storefront, ready to collect dust here until Steam eventually dies or takes them down. I mentioned that the Unity game engine played a role in this, and that's due in part to the asset store more than the engine itself. The storefront is a place for developers to sell or buy assets, tools, effects, what have you, primarily meant to be a way to cut down on costs and time expenditures. By using these assets, the developer now no longer has to build everything from scratch and can focus on more of the creative aspects. The bad actors in this situation would take a bunch of pre-made models, find ready-made levels, and clumsily mash those together until they got a stable product. There's no effort put
put into story and no time spent creating original assets. They'd just post them to Steam and hope someone bought it. There was a shocking amount of unturned clones in the store looking in to cash in on the craze, and most of them were made from the same Unity assets. A significant portion of these have been delisted, but some still managed to stay around. So when we look at the graph from 2014 to 2017, we see a spike in games about zombies because of those factors. Now you might think that since Greenlight is over and the general populace has caught on to the grift that things might stop. Shockingly, no. Steam still needed a way for their indie games to get on their platform, so the process is now a lot simpler. You fill out paperwork, send $100, and Steam either approves or rejects the game. If approved, they refund your $100 after the first $1,000 made in sales. But Steam doesn't seem to care about the quality of the games they let in, because in 2021, we'd see around 134 zombie games released, and a majority of those come from Steam. Now I did a second version of this graph where I removed the Steam games with low user scores or clearly asset flips and early access titles that haven't left that phase. This new chart shows a significant dip in titles. Peak year for zombies is now 2010. But there's a consistent number of titles coming out in this era still, and that's mostly due to the rise in VR. Regardless of Steam quality control, the rush to make and publish VR stuff in the past few years has led to a similar situation as Steam Greenlight. On a different subject, not many AAA zombie games would come out in this era, aside from the threat of another mediocre Dead Island on the horizon.
Sorry, this script is so old that I made a Dead Island 2 joke that is both out of date but factually accurate. On a similar tangent, did you know that there are 6 total Dead Island games? There's Dead Island 1.5, better known as Riptide, the cel-shaded hack-and-slash Escape from Dead Island. There's the delisted iOS tower defense game Dead Island Survivor. And finally, there's Dead Island Epidemic, a MOBA.
Dead Island Epidemic is unlike any other online multiplayer experience.
Sorry, Zomba, that didn't make it out of beta. Deep Silver put a lot of faith into a pretty generic zombie series.
We would get 2 titles that reset expectation for this genre, the first being a sequel to the game that propped this era up for prestige, The Last of Us Part 2. On display here is a perfect example of zombies being used as a tool in a storyteller's kit. There is a war going on in the middle of an apocalypse. However, enough time has passed that people have reclaimed bits of the civilization lost and are scraping and clawing at the walls to keep it that way. Making the ongoing conflict even more desperate are the zombies that are still an ever-present menace. The dueling threats of facing the extinction of the last scraps of civilization and cannibalistic mushrooms work in tandem to make the bleak atmosphere palpable. To that point, the combat has been amplified and finely tuned to feel as heavy as possible. Similar in many ways to the original, but this time Ellie being more nimble than Joel while having less combat training makes the gameplay feel more frantic. Unless you've perfectly MacGyvered a maze of traps around the AI's path, you'll have to make split-second decisions that lead to some gruesome moments. Adding a darkness to the combat that does a better job at telling the story than any of the expertly crafted cutscenes could. But that's really only when you're fighting humans. Dispatching the infected is almost a nuisance. They're set dressing, a simple obstacle to overcome, which is wild because the zombies here are far more intimidating than those seen in the first title. The Last of Us Part 2 is one of the first games where zombies take a back seat in the best possible way. The second game to tentpole this era of prestige zombie games is not one that I think will go over well considering the mixed critical consensus and recent rantings of the director, but Days Gone is the pinnacle of the 7th generation open world zombie mentality. Listen, I know that sounds like an insult, but I mean it as a very sincere compliment. I am right there with a majority of players who are growing tired with the insistence on every game being a giant playground to drive around. But there is no better way to showcase the size and scale of a plague like this than letting the player move around and experience that firsthand. And the folks behind Days Gone get that. It's clear to me that Ben's studio has absorbed the lessons found through the shortcomings of the last generation and actually applied that to their game, with things like engaging mechanics that feel familiar yet fresh, a roster of characters that don't feel completely expendable, enjoyably realistic motorcycle travel, a hot protagonist, a solid mid-game twist, some of the most impressive horde mechanics seen in this genre, worthwhile side objectives, a hot protagonist, post-game content that clearly understands what makes this game tick, the baby from Death Stranding as your gas tank, a killer arsenal of weapons, and a hot protagonist. I understand that the biggest complaint levied against Days Gone is the lackluster dialogue and story. I think it's fair not to enjoy these things, but the pace, stake, and gameplay and attractive lead are all fun enough to subvert that. I agree that the dialogue wasn't great. Hearing the main character constantly mutter to himself was an odd choice, and constantly hearing him do so was very annoying. But compare that to a different open world zombie game that takes itself seriously. Dying Light didn't get this level of backlash, and has a story that is arguably more boring. Not to mention the stale dialogue and sections that remove your agency in order to play in a very specific way. I feel that Days Gone is the logical conclusion to everything open world zombie. Given the current oversaturation of this genre, I would highly recommend revisiting this one in a few years. Aside from those two games, this era shows a lack of AAA titles, a fact that wouldn't deter Turtle Rock Studios from trying to recapture the magic of Left 4 Dead.
Despite that game being very accessible to this day with constant sales and very, very high player numbers.
Eventually, it released to the world, showing us just how important Valve's oversight was to the first project. But on the other hand, a zombie co-op game would become one of the most profitable titles of the past decade. Most people forget that Fortnite started out as more than just a battle royale. Fort construction meets tower defense as you fight waves of rotters, pretty far off what the game is known for currently. Another trend in this era is the revival of the Resident Evil series. The 7th generation was not kind to Capcom's beloved IP, with some more controversial entries to the series. But with a few well-placed remakes and 2 critically acclaimed numbered sequels, we would get a franchise that has been brought back from the brink. The final games of note are the VR titles. While most are not much more than self-guided rail shooters, The Walking Dead Saints and Sinners is a killer app for VR. There is no game that will give you a better experience for what it's like to take down a zombie. Seeing them up close as you nail them in the head, or feeling your heart race as your health is low and you're being chased, or even the anxiety of shooting and missing with limited ammo makes for an unmatched zombie experience. The difficulty in taking down a single zombie makes the entire experience feel weighty in a way that most horde-clearing zombie titles don't have. My only complaint is that I wish this game had more bombastic realism like Dead Rising, where everything is a weapon. I should be able to slam a telephone receiver into some ghouly's cerebellum and get more than a dial tone. I understand that forcing the player to scavenge for specific weapons to hold on to and manage makes the game more intense, but there's gotta be a balance. My biggest surprise was that there's a ton of movement in this game, and it's properly compensated for so that folks don't get sick while playing it. The Walking Dead Saints and Sinners is a full 8-hour experience. You're getting a lot of game for something that's limited to VR, and it's genuinely impressive. I'd even go so far as to put Walking Dead Saints and Sinners right up there with Beat Saber, Job Simulator, and Half-Life Alyx as the titles that are selling VR as a worthwhile endeavor. Finally, there's the recent explosion of zombie television. This shouldn't come as much of a surprise considering most media trends over the past few years are a result of the streaming boom. Said impact hits twofold for zombie media. Not only does this format favor long-form episodic adventures, it has also made foreign media far more accessible to an international audience. We've got shows from Portugal, India, the Philippines, and most prominently, South Korea. Netflix becoming the home of some of the most fresh Undead takes. Sweet Home, a show that takes notes from Resident Evil's monster design and uses that to morph a typical zombie narrative into something yet unseen. My personal favorite being Kingdom. Someone likened it to a Korean Game of Thrones with zombies mixed in, and I'd have to agree. The political tension is thick, the scale is massive, and the cinematography is expertly done. This is the kind of show that keeps me excited for the future of zombie media.
Most of these shows, games, movies, books take place in the US or Britain during modern times, which means we've pretty well explored the depths of these locations. Branching out from these settings and time periods, the possibilities become far more interesting and unsaturated. I would love for more shows like Kingdom to tackle the question of how the undead would affect ancient civilizations like Rome, Greece, Egypt, etc. Coming from a time where we saw an increase in films that valued spectacle over story, it feels great to have media that takes zombies seriously and explores the different cultural effects that they might have.
Coming back to it, I found new, fresh interpretations that have me excited to once again re-engage with something I've held so much nostalgia for. Zombies are being used to tackle heavier and heavier subject matter, positioning them for longevity. The more cultural takes that we introduce, the more unique stories we get to experience, seeing a new generation of creatives taking this force of nature in different directions. And frankly, I'm excited for it.
The human fascination with death has led us to reanimate the deceased, only to kill them again. What started as a visualization for slavery in Haiti morphed into a gross misinterpretation for Hollywood to use as a prop, later being reconstructed into a violent mirror for societal issues, finally diverting in two different directions, some choosing to keep the serious tone and thematic elements, while others would ditch that in favor of a less serious, almost cartoonish take on zombies.
Down here. So when did zombie fatigue set in? You could look at everything I've said so far and make a guess that 2014 to 2015 was sort of when the zombie died again. That's what I thought going into this. So to avoid that bias, let's look at the stats to get more information.
Starting with a broad stroke, looking at Google Trends search data for the word zombie, we find that search volume peaked in May of 2012. Later spikes would be seen in October of the following years. There's a good chance that some of these spikes are due to things like the Florida bath salts incident or a release of a Rob Zombie album, but most of these spikes align with season premieres of The Walking Dead. The term zombie apocalypse would see a spike in 2012 as well, but those are general searches. Zombie films and zombie television shows have shown a steady rise over the years. Zombie games saw a peak in October of 2011 and have gone down since. Searches for zombie books and comics were down while zombie manga is going up. Putting all of those searches together, we can see an average trend. They all seem to top out at 2011 and fall from there. But that's just Google search data. It shows general interests and queries, but doesn't paint a full picture. The other half of this question comes in the form of trending media, as companies will only release more when general interest is high. So let's look at the spreadsheets. 2008 was the peak year for sheer output of zombie films, which then sees a slow decline after that. 2010 through 2012 would be the height of zombie books, each year seeing 22 releases, after which the graph drops off drastically. Zombie TV shows are on the steady rise with a peak in 2019. Games have seen an obscene growth in recent years, mostly stemming from Steam's lackadaisical approach to independent publishing on their platform. Looking at the unrestricted games graph, we see that 2021 saw the highest output of zombie titles, but if we call that to exclude low-effort Unity flips, then we see that 2010 saw the highest output. But for the most part, games have maintained their numbers since then. Looking at the data, it's clear that the height of the zombie craze was from 2008 to 2012, which does align with the Google search results.
But data is only one side of the subjective question. I may not be consuming zombie media at the same rate that I was in high school, but I'm not avoiding them, and most likely neither are you. There's still desire for this content.
If I had to guess what the next era of zombie content would be, I'd say that the popularity of HBO's adaptation of The Last of Us will shape the next wave of creators. The show has dredged up long forgotten conversations that players were having in 2013 and 2020, and now we see a larger audience talking about the effects of a fungal virus, as well as the ethical questions that the series poses. With a new game and season on the horizon, this holds potential to get a wider audience excited for more sinister versions of the undead. There will always be purists gatekeeping anything that isn't a Romero zombie, but I think the definition of zombies will shift in the coming years. It won't completely overshadow what we know as zombies, but it will add a new flair that I think the genre needs. Additionally, we'll get more iterations of the infested by different countries putting their own spin on things. This will open up the floodgates for creative cultural fusions. The different social norms, folklores, and locations will allow for a plethora of fresh ideas.
Zombies crave Doritos.
CDC experts say you should prepare for zombies just like you would prepare for any real-life emergency.
Michonne did take that peanut butter protein bar.
When it comes to relieving the incurable hunger for flesh, you might be tempted to reach for over-the-counter solutions like Romerithol or Zedquil. With drugs like those, you'll be reaching for the bottle over and over again. And as the muscle loss starts to set in, those are some tough pills to swallow. Free yourself with once-a-day Zombrex, the only fast-acting shot guaranteed to last all day. 4 of the 7 remaining doctors suggest taking Zombrex within 3 hours of first infection. Zombrex should not be taken if you're nursing, pregnant, or may become pregnant. Zombrex is not a cure for zombification. Once started, the user must maintain usage or else zombification will accelerate. Zombrex may cause nausea, heartburn, upset stomach, and diarrhea. Stop taking Zombrex if it's the last shot and I need it too. Ask your doctor if once daily Zombrex is right for you.
So, if like me, you're also tired of zombie media, now's a great time to get back into it. Because the water is, well, it's got like blood and limbs and stuff, but it's ever expanding, always getting more interesting. Thanks for watching.